Early in the last days of fall, fog spilled down the Tennessee hills like a thick, icy blanket, drowning the tall old pines and the winding trails that time had long let moss reclaim. In the place locals still called half-warning, half-reverence Red Hollow, there was no sound except the damp shuffle of leaves underfoot and the slow, steady breathing of a forest far too used to swallowing human secrets. Mark Ellison, 40 years into his ritual of autumn mornings, froze as he stepped past a moss-covered boulder. He wasn't the kind of man who startled easily, but something about this morning pressed against his chest one heavy, deliberate beat like the woods were watching him more than he was watching them. Mark bent down to tighten his bowstring and inhaled the cold, wet scent of young pines. The white fog drifted right in front of him, so thick he had to brush it aside with his hand just to see the trail. Then he saw it, a small patch of ground ahead, unnaturally flat. Stones stacked together as if someone had tried to hide something beneath them. A lifetime of living in the woods made Mark slow his steps. He knelt, touched the thin layer of rocks. They were ice cold. When he tipped a larger stone to the side, the dirt beneath pushed up something pale gray. At first he thought it was an animal bone. Bones scattered in the underbrush weren't unusual, but the curve of it, the way the smooth surface caught the weak morning light. His heart skipped, his fingers trembled. This wasn't an animal. It was a piece of human bone. Mark swallowed, struggling to steady his breath. The forest around him suddenly fell completely silent, as if nature itself was holding still. He rose slowly, eyes sweeping the thin trunks stretching upward like brittle fingers. He'd walked this area hundreds of times, but today, it didn't feel like the place he knew. When Mark pulled out his phone to call the police, his voice scraped rough in his throat. Something about this spot made him not want to stand there a second longer, like he had brushed against a story that was never meant to be uncovered. And when the call finally connected, he spoke the words that would later appear in headlines for weeks. "I think I've found something. Something that shouldn't be here." More than 2 decades earlier, in this very place, 4 children from the same family had walked into the woods and never returned. 22 years, 22 winters, 22 nights of candles, prayers, and the same aching question, what had they all missed? For 22 years, no one knew what happened. Until this morning. Until the moment Mark Ellison saw that pale bone resting beneath the stones laid by an unfamiliar hand. Until Red Hollow began giving back the secrets it had kept for far too long. To understand why this disappearance left an entire community unable to forget, we have to go back years, back, before Red Hollow, before the headlines, back to when those children were still running barefoot across their grandparents' lawn, where summer always hummed with cicadas, as if peace itself had a sound. The Raburns and the Thomases lived only a few dusty miles apart, connected by a red dirt road curling through cornfields. 2 branches of one extended family, yet raised almost under the same roof. The adults were busy, the crops were unpredictable, and the kids grew up tangled together like wild vines. In their memories, summer wasn't a season. It was a feeling. The smell of old wood in their grandfather's barn, the trickle of water from the creek behind the farm, the evening sun melting over the hills while the 4 of them shared cold sodas on the back of a pickup truck. Josh, the oldest, was 19 that year. He had a smile that made people feel welcomed, the kind that drew trust without asking for it. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He just showed up when people needed him. He'd just bought a used silver SUV paint peeling on the front bumper. But to him, it was a ticket to the world. That fall, he would leave town for the first time, heading to Knoxville for college. His younger brother, Ryan, couldn't have been more different. 17, lean, brown-haired, with deep-set eyes that always looked like they were quietly studying something no one else could see. He preferred books to baseball, notebooks to conversation. But when he smiled, you could see a little piece of Josh in him. They weren't alike, but together they fit 2 halves that only made sense side by side. Caleb, 18, belonged to the Thomas side, tall, gentle, always ready for hard work. He wasn't sure what came after graduation. His parents said he could join his uncle at the mechanic's shop if he wanted, but Caleb hesitated. as if he needed a little more time to breathe before deciding the shape of his whole future. And Amy, 15, the youngest, yet the light of the group. She had a tumble of blonde hair and eyes as bright as morning. People say every child has a moment where the world believes they might grow up to become something beautiful. For Amy, that moment never faded. She could coax laughter out of all three boys, even when laughter felt impossible. Those four kids, with all the innocence and closeness youth allows, spent nearly every summer together. They pitched tents behind their grandparents' house, held competitions for the biggest catch, dared each other to cross the icy creek in May. They had conversations no one recorded, yet somehow those words still live inside them, inside all who loved them. That's why the final trip mattered so much. It wasn't a grand vacation or some daring adventure. It was a promise between four nearly grown children who weren't quite ready to let go of their shared childhood. Josh was leaving town. Caleb might soon be working full-time. Ryan was stumbling toward a future he wasn't sure he wanted. And Amy, smallest of all, feared change the most. The trip would last 2 days. A camping weekend. In the same woods their grandfather once took their fathers hunting, back before any of them were born. A farewell ritual, done the way folks in Tennessee have always done things, with heart, with history, with simple sincerity. When Josh mentioned it over dinner the week before, his mother remembered one thing he said: just 2 days. 2 days for us to relive our childhood one last time. The adults smiled. They had watched these kids grow, and they understood. And so they let them go. Because parenting is learning to loosen your grip, to trust the roads your children choose. And above all, no one thought those 2 days would be the last time they saw the four kids laughing together. No one thought time would freeze at the end of that weekend. No one thought those bright, familiar faces would vanish into the tree line without a trace. No one thought a simple goodbye to childhood trip would become the unbridgeable line between what was and what would never be again. And as Josh's SUV rolled down the old dirt road in front of the grandparents' house, red dust lifting into the warm summer air, they had no way of knowing that moment. That plain, quiet, ordinary moment would haunt them for the next 22 years. When the four cousins left town, the sun was still hanging high over the Tennessee sky, pouring gold over the road leading out to Route 19, until it looked dipped in warm honey. They talked and laughed the whole way, windows down, letting the wind carry in the scent of dry grass and the constant hum of cicadas that clung to the thick July heat. The small gas station on Route 19 was the kind of place almost everyone stopped at before driving out of town. A weathered wooden building with a faded tin roof. Outside sat an old, chipped bench where locals took their morning coffee. Nothing about that day seemed any different, except for the part no one knew, that they were witnessing the last moment the four kids would ever be seen alive and well. The security camera mounted under the tin awning captured footage at exactly 5:46 p.m. A short clip barely 3 minutes long, but later, it would become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. In the video, Josh steps out first. He's smiling, tossing his keys once in the air. Ryan follows, ducking his head to shield his eyes from the glare. Caleb climbs out from the back, shaking his head as Amy hops down with a backpack nearly as big as she is. Everything in the video is ordinary. Too ordinary. Young faces, light footsteps, jokes you can't hear but can almost feel. Linda, the clerk who'd worked at the station for more than 20 years, remembers it clearly. She said the kids did exactly what they always did. Josh asked where the cheapest firewood was. Ryan picked out a few bottles of water, reading the labels as if weighing some great decision. Caleb joked that they should buy 2 boxes of matches because last time he and Josh nearly failed to get a fire going. And Amy, hugging a disposable camera to her chest, announced that she would photograph everything so they wouldn't forget later. Linda said they left the counter smiling. But she also remembered something else. Something so small it nearly slipped through the cracks. When Josh handed over the cash, she noticed his hand tremble. Not much, just the barest shake, the kind you see in someone who knows they're about to step away from the familiar. She recalled thinking he was simply nervous about starting college, but when the police questioned her years later, she admitted that what she saw in his eyes that day looked a little like hesitation. A kind of instinct so faint that even the person feeling it might not give it a name. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to shift. A thin band of gray clouds gathered in the west. Late July in Tennessee was usually too hot for the weather to change that fast, but that evening, the air tightened just a little. Not a chill you could see, just one you could feel tracing the back of your neck. Caleb noticed it too when he stepped outside. He pulled at his collar, glanced up, and muttered to Josh that it might rain. Josh laughed and waved him off, saying the forecast promised clear skies all weekend. "We even packed jackets," he said, "just in case. Relax." Ryan reacted differently. He held back near the door, staring toward the stretch of trees as if trying to understand something shifting just beyond sight. He said nothing he rarely did, but people still remember what his mother said later. That the night before the trip, Ryan had stood at his window for a long time. And when she asked what was wrong, he answered, "I don't know why, but I have a strange feeling about this trip. And Amy." She was still smiling, still holding her camera, still buzzing with the thrill of capturing every moment of their adventure. It's almost impossible to imagine that the girl who lit up at the sight of a single unusual butterfly would one day exist only in the last few frames of a disposable camera. The clip ends just as Josh opens the car door and glances back at his three cousins. In the honey gold light, he looks older than 19. As if he sensed that after this trip, each of them would scatter into a future none of them could yet picture. As if he wanted to hold that moment just a heartbeat longer. People talk about intuition, about the universe sending warnings. If something tugged at Josh's chest in that instant, he hid it behind the same easy smile he'd worn his whole life. 5:46. The final 3 minutes. 3 quiet, unremarkable minutes that no one realized would be the last moments ever captured on camera. Everything that came afterward, every fear, every mystery, every truth buried under 22 years of questions would unfold far beyond the reach of any lens. Sunday night, 2003. A summer night thick with the smell of damp earth and late-blooming wildflowers. Folks in Monroe County still say July that year felt strange. The sky changed color too fast. The air hung heavy, as if something unseen hovered above the tree line. No one paid attention. No one thought it would mark the beginning of a wound the town would carry for the next 20 years. When the clock slipped past 8, the adults in both families started glancing at each other more than at the TV. They tried to stay calm, saying the kids were probably roasting marshmallows by the fire, probably just having fun, probably losing track of time. Josh had gone camping since he was little. He knew those woods like the back of his hand, but every reassurance sounded like a line repeated only to soothe themselves. By 9, worry was no longer worry. It became something weightier, something that sank into the air. Ryan's mom called Amy's mom. Amy's mom called Caleb's dad. Even the familiar numbers felt wrong as they rang and rang with no answer. Unease crept into every sentence, every breath. At about 9:30, the Robern family's phone rang. Ryan's name lit up the screen. For one fleeting moment, the entire kitchen seemed to brighten, as if someone had thrown the windows open. His mother rushed to answer. And she heard only this, a sharp static pop, a breath, half a second of electric hiss, then silence. No words. No call for help. No wind through the receiver. Only cold static, colder than the approaching storm outside. When she called back, the phone was already off. No one saw how she braced herself against the counter, her hands trembling so badly she dropped the glass she was holding. And no one knew until years later that every time she heard radio interference afterward, her heart clenched the same way. By 10, the families called the police. Sheriff Donnelly, back when he didn't yet have the gray hair he'd be known for, sent deputies to the trailhead immediately. He'd handled plenty of missing person calls, hunters losing their way, campers wandering off the path. It happened. But the moment he heard about the static-filled call, he knew this wasn't like the others. As the patrol car swept its headlights along the dirt road leading to County Road 214, the rain started to fall. Not much, just enough to draw up that familiar southern scent, the smell that always meant a storm was coming. Something unsettled, something wrong. Josh's SUV was found within minutes, parked at a small turnout near the entrance to the woods. The dim streetlight above hit the chipped silver paint just right, making the vehicle look ghostly as if it had been standing there waiting for them. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, no dropped gear. Everything was neat, unnervingly neat. A kind of order that didn't match four excited kids heading into a camping trip. When Donnelly opened the door, a chill ran straight through him. The handle was so smooth, the flashlight beam slid along it without catching a single smudge. He ran a gloved hand along the inside window. Smooth, clean, too clean, unnaturally clean. Like someone had wiped away every trace. Only one set of prints remained. Josh's. Not Ryan's. Not Caleb's. Not Amy's. Every other trace of them had vanished from the car, as if they'd never stepped inside. When the families arrived, their breaths broke in their throats. Amy's mother placed a hand on the hood, then pulled back. It was colder than it should have been. Caleb's father circled the SUV twice, then stood still, hands on his hips, head bowed as if listening for his son's breath in the air. Officers swept the ground with their lights. No drag marks, no broken branches, no disturbed soil. The rain had slicked the earth, but something else was wrong. The ground looked untouched, as if the woods themselves had smoothed it over. Donnelly stood at the open door for a long moment. He scanned the back seat. 2 sleeping bags, a food box, a first aid kit, all packed neatly, untouched. The sight pulled something tight in his chest, because if they hadn't used any of it, it meant they never got the chance. A young deputy suggested they'd wandered into the woods and gotten lost. But Donnelly shook his head. He'd lived his whole life in these parts. He knew what it looked like when someone walked away angry or scared. He knew the signs of panic, and he knew the blank, silent spaces left behind in a kidnapping. But what he saw that night went beyond anything he knew. A car wiped clean. A silent phone call. 4 children gone at the very edge of a forest people had whispered about for generations. A forest said to have its own way of keeping what enters it. And as the steady rain turned heavy, the families huddled together, shivering from cold and fear. Donnelly stared at the dark mass of trees ahead. He didn't say it aloud, but a single thought echoed in his mind, a thought he would still refuse to speak even 20 years later. Something in those woods saw them first, and decided not to let them leave. The next morning, Red Hollow woke under a heavy sky. The night's rain had just stopped, leaving beads of water clinging to the leaves, casting a silvery haze across the forest. To anyone born in Tennessee, that scent was familiar, the smell of earth breathing after the storm. But that morning, the damp air carried something else. A tension. As if the forest itself was holding a secret it refused to let go. Sheriff Donnelly had been on site since a little after 6. The coffee in his hand was still hot, but he hadn't taken a single sip. Beside him, the families stood in small, exhausted clusters, faces drained after a sleepless night. Amy's mother clutched her daughter's old knitted scarf, lifting it to her nose now and then as if trying to find the faintest trace of her child's scent. Caleb's father paced back and forth, hands shoved deep in his pockets, as though trying to anchor whatever courage he still had left. No one said much. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything they might say felt too close to becoming true. By 7:30, the first search teams arrived. Pickup trucks lined the dirt road, headlights still on in the dim morning light. The search dogs barked sharply, as though they, too, felt the urgency. Overhead, the rescue helicopter from Knoxville thundered across the ridges, its heavy echo bouncing off the tree-covered hills. Before they began, Donnelly gathered everyone. His voice was low but steady. "We'll sweep in circles, 200 meters out from the vehicle. Then expand. Don't leave anything unchecked." Worried faces nodded. This was a small community. Everyone here had watched those kids grow up running barefoot after church, chasing fireflies on summer nights. Their fear wasn't for strangers, it was for their own. As the teams moved into the woods, Josh's SUV stood silently behind them like a specter. The morning light glinted off the windows, but inside the car looked strangely cold, as though it held knowledge no one else could see. The dogs were released first. They sniffed each child's clothing, then bolted southeast into the trees. The smell of mud, moss, and young pines rose with every step. But exactly 200 meters in, all three dogs stopped. One circled, one barked once, sharply. The last stood perfectly still, head bowed. The handler tried again, twice. Same reaction. The trail didn't fade, it ended. Abruptly. Like someone had drawn an invisible line and cut the scent clean out of the air. A volunteer suggested that last night's rain might have washed the trail away, but Donnelly knew better. He'd tracked people through storms far worse. Scents weakened, thinned, scattered, but they never vanished in a straight, perfect line. He stared deeper into the woods. The wind rustled the branches gently. But farther in, where the pines grew thicker, he saw a patch of darkness standing unnaturally still in the shifting light. Around 10 o'clock, a local farmer pulled up in his old pickup, hat brim frayed, face lined by years under southern sun and wind. His voice was heavy when he spoke. "Last night, round 9:30, I heard something up on the ridge," he said. "Sounded like metal dragging against metal. Thought it was just the wind hitting a loose piece of tin. But it was too even. Too steady. Like somebody was pulling a chain." The search team went silent. Normally, reports like that would be brushed aside, but in that fog-thick morning, anything could be a clue. Half an hour later, a volunteer found something strange. A small piece of paper, soaked and smeared with mud. But the writing still legible. South Path. No one knew who wrote it. No one knew when it was left. But the handwriting was rushed, uneven, as if someone scribbled it down moments before being dragged away by something they couldn't fight. Ryan kept a small notebook. He often scribbled directions in it, but his family swore the handwriting wasn't his, nor Josh's, nor Caleb's, nor Amy's. Donnelly stared at the paper for a long time before slipping it into his breast pocket. He didn't speak, but something in his eyes darkened, like he'd just stepped into a part of the story he was never meant to enter. By noon, the sun was burning overhead. The light bounced off the treetops, making sweat gather along everyone's necks. Yet the forest remained cool. Too cool. And the damp, musty smell hadn't faded. The helicopter circled above. The hills lay fully revealed under the bright sky, every clearing, every dry creek bed, every patch of exposed soil. But nothing moved. No figures. No gear. No torn clothing. No signs of flight or struggle. Not even footprints. As if the four children had never stepped onto the trail at all. By late afternoon, when the search crews returned, many were too exhausted to stand. Josh's mother sank onto the stone step beside the SUV, holding her son's old baseball cap to her chest. Amy's mother stood behind the vehicle, eyes scanning the trees for the small figure she still half believed might step out at any second. Caleb's father crouched down, his hands digging into the wet earth, as if trying to hold on to a world that made sense. People often say the first day of a search brings the most hope, but in Red Hollow, hope began dissolving almost immediately. The forest gave nothing back. No answers. No paths. No signs. It simply stood there, vast, silent, deliberate. Donnelly lingered a long time before calling off the first day. New lines creased his face, ones that hadn't been there the night before. He stared at the darkened tree line, and deep down, though he wished he didn't believe it, he knew. Red Hollow had begun keeping its story, and it doesn't willingly return what it chooses to claim. By the second day, Red Hollow was no longer just the site of a search. It had become a mirror reflecting the kind of pain the families of the missing children never imagined they would be forced to carry. People often say tragedy doesn't strike like lightning. It comes like a long, persistent rain seeping into every crack of the human heart. And from there, the fractures begin to spread. That morning, as officers brought more volunteers into the woods, the command area felt heavier than the day before. Everyone looked worn down, hollow-eyed after nearly 2 sleepless nights. Josh's mother stood beside a patrol car, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Ryan's father kept a hand on her shoulder, though his own fingers trembled. Fear, once it spreads, doesn't choose where to stop. Then the thing everyone dreaded, the thing everyone knew was inevitable, began to show itself. Quiet comments, accidental accusations, Questions no one could truly answer. We shouldn't have let them go. You should have checked your son's phone. I should have told Josh not to leave town. We should have known something wasn't right. Those should-haves dropped like pebbles, but pebbles pile up, and soon they were too heavy for anyone in the family to bear. Eventually, they turned into anger. Amy's mother was the first to break. She sobbed openly, saying the trip should never have been allowed. That if she had kept Amy home that day, her daughter wouldn't have vanished into the cold dark of the forest. Caleb's father tried to comfort her, but his words only fanned the flames. "What do you know?" she snapped. "Your son was 18. He was grown. Amy was 15. She was still a child. She shouldn't have gone." Caleb's father stepped back as if struck. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Each of them carried guilt in their chest, but none of them understood yet that guilt wasn't the root of anything. Despair was, and despair had a way of turning people against the very ones who stood beside them. When officers stepped in to calm things down, the tension only sharpened. Ryan's mother turned to Donnelly, her voice shaking. "Why haven't you found anything? Why can the helicopters see nothing? Why did the dogs lose the trail? Why was the car wiped clean like that? You're the sheriff," she said. "You should have answers." Donnelly stood still for a long moment. He didn't look away from her eyes, those eyes holding a fragile, desperate hope that almost broke him, because he knew the truth. In these woods, some questions stayed silent, even when every human effort had been poured into finding the answers. "We're doing everything we can," he said quietly. But even the most honest words fall short when spoken to a mother standing on the thin line between hope and despair. A cousin of Caleb stepped forward, raising his voice. "All you've done is walk around in circles. If you'd been faster, if you'd locked down the woods right away, the kids would be home by now." "If," Donnelly didn't reply. Not because he had no response, but because he understood. Anger is the last strand of control people cling to when everything else has slipped from their hands. It's the reaction of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, trying not to look down. Volunteers drifted aside to give the family space. A young deputy whispered to Donnelly that they could clear the families from the command area. But Donnelly shook his head. These were their children. This was their grief. He wouldn't take that from them. The air felt brittle, like it might crack under the weight of what they were all holding inside. By midday, the sun grew harsh. Under that heat, mothers, fathers, uncles, aunts, all of them began to wilt. No one had the strength to hold up the facade of steadiness they'd carried since the night before. Josh's mother leaned against the SUV, her hand trembling as she rested it on the spotless window. She whispered, barely audible, "Why is it so clean? Why isn't there a single trace of my son?" No one answered. But everyone nearby felt the chill of that question sink into their own bones. The SUV's unnatural cleanliness wasn't just evidence. It was a symbol of something that had happened out there that none of them could comprehend. By late afternoon, as the search teams returned in silence, raindrops began to fall. Not heavy, just the kind of gentle Tennessee rain that usually cooled the earth. But when the first drops touched the ground, Amy's mother broke again. She cried that Amy hated the cold, that her daughter must be terrified somewhere out in the damp forest. Others couldn't hold back their tears either. An older man, a family friend, said he'd never seen a rain feel so heavy, despite how lightly it fell because it landed on hearts already breaking. Day 2 ended with more questions than answers, and the families who had been each other's strength for so many years now faced a new truth. The fear wasn't only about the children being gone. The fear came from within, from the helplessness turning them against one another, forcing them to search for blame, for reasons, for somewhere to put the pain. Because in moments like these, grief needs something to hold on to. Donnelly watched from a distance. He understood, and he knew that if Red Hollow remained silent, if the forest continued giving nothing back, these families wouldn't just lose their children, they would lose themselves. And he also knew that from this moment forward, the search wasn't just about finding 4 kids. It was a fight to keep the people left behind from falling apart in the heart of a forest that offered nothing to cling to. As the search stretched into the following days, Red Hollow was no longer just a forest. It became a name spoken by everyone in town, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with eyes that refused to meet. Rumors spread from front porches, from the lone general store on Route 19, from porches where people gathered at dusk to pray the 4 children would come home. In the American South, people believe the land has a memory of its own, that every ridge, every creek, keeps stories people aren't meant to see. And Red Hollow had always been that kind of place. A patch of woods passed down through generations in tales meant to scare children and make adults tread carefully. Legend had it that decades ago, part of the forest floor collapsed into a sudden, yawning sinkhole. Before the county fenced the area off, a farmer nearby claimed several of his cattle disappeared without a trace. Others swore that when the wind blew hard, the place gave off a metallic rasp like metal scraping against metal that raised goosebumps even on the hottest nights. No one ever proved any of it, but everyone believed it anyway. The way people believe things they cannot explain. So when 4 children went missing, the old stories woke up again. The elders whispered that the forest had opened its mouth once more. Children cried because they were forbidden from going anywhere near the trail. And adults began fearing the very tales they had once dismissed as folklore. Rumors about the sinkhole spread faster than the official search. At night, beneath the soft yellow glow of the street lamps, people gathered on porches insisting the kids must have fallen into it. Some claimed they'd heard strange noises in the woods during the storm. Others swore their flashlights had caught grass bent in patterns they couldn't explain, as though something heavy had slid across it. There was no evidence for any of it, yet each story carried the weight of fear. And when fear spreads, it grows into something larger than itself, collective panic. By the 3rd day, the media descended on the town. First, the local news crews, then reporters from Nashville. Big cameras, microphones, bright lights slicing through the misty mornings. All of it turned the narrow road into Red Hollow, into something unrecognizable. As if Monroe County wasn't a quiet southern town anymore, but the stage for a tragedy the whole nation was watching unfold. Reporters fired questions non-stop. Was this a kidnapping? Were there any suspects? Did the sinkhole truly exist? Was there evidence of a crime? The families, already exhausted to their breaking point, became targets for dozens of questions no one should ever have to answer. Amy's mother was forced to stand before cameras with swollen eyes. Josh's father repeated the same line he'd said for days, that he just wanted his son to come home. Ryan and Caleb's names were spoken over and over in news segments, as though they were characters in a story they never chose to be part of. Sometimes the families refused to answer. But when reporters blocked the path, when microphones were shoved too close, their grief became an image broadcast across the region. And when a major newspaper printed the headline, 4 Tennessee teens vanish into the shadows of a cursed forest, the people of Monroe County felt something slip away. Not just 4 kids, but the fragile piece their little town had always lived on. Online, the rumors spread even faster. Message boards filled with theories. Ritualistic kidnapping. A hermit living deep in the woods. Poisonous gas. Underground tunnels. Everyone built their own version of the story, as if solving a puzzle they didn't understand. Meanwhile, Donnelly held on to whatever steadiness he could muster. He knew rumors could ruin an investigation faster than any mistake, but no matter how often he spoke calmly, no matter how many times he tried to settle the town, Monroe County trembled like the surface of water struck by a stone. He went door to door, telling people there was no evidence of any sinkhole connection. But fear shrinks truth until it becomes small and quiet. People don't believe what is proven. They believe what they feel, especially when that feeling is fueled by shared grief. At night, when the sun dipped behind the low roofs, candles were lit across town. The old church filled with people, some who had never met before, holding each other as the pastor prayed for the children. Something deeply human unfolded amid the chaos. A woman brought dinner to the Robburn family. A man delivered blankets to the Thomas house. A group of high school students made paper fans to hand out to rescue workers. Pain can divide, but it can also weave people tightly together. Yet despite all the light, all the prayers, Red Hollow remained still a silent silhouette of something unnamed. And when night fell again, the wind cut through the pines with a sound like metal brushing metal. People said they heard it from town, drifting out of the forest like a dark reminder. This story would not end easily. Red Hollow's secret was not ready to be found. Something beneath that old earth was still waiting to be named. By the end of the second week, the search across Monroe County had expanded far beyond anyone's original expectations. 2 helicopters had swept the ridgelines around Red Hollow for days. More than 50 volunteers and professional rescue teams had combed every slope, every dry creek bed, every abandoned cabin, every overgrown footpath, but all of them returned with empty hands. And then, on a cloudy afternoon when the sunlight thinned into a weak streak on the horizon, Sheriff Donnelly stood in the clearing near the trailhead and said the words no one wanted to hear. "We're suspending the large-scale search." The words dropped into the air like a stone. No one breathed. No one moved. Even the cicadas buzzing in the late summer heat sounded like thin metal scraping together, turning the silence deafening. Amy's mother collapsed to her knees, her trembling fingers clawing at the dirt. Josh's father stood frozen, staring into the forest as if sheer will alone could pierce the dense trees and bring back the 4 familiar silhouettes. Ryan and Caleb were no longer just missing children, they were 2 voids, 2 wounds no family could set aside. In Southern culture, family is a circle that never lets go, a place where no matter how far someone wanders, they always find their way back. But those 4 children did not come back, and their absence became more than grief. It became a quiet erosion, wearing down the heart, day after day, month after month. After the official search withdrew, the families did not stop. They searched alone. No maps, no equipment, only worn-out boots and the fragile hope that one more step, just one, might uncover what everyone else had missed. Every Sunday, rain or shine, they walked. Caleb's father carried a flashlight and a handpick. Ryan's mother brought one of her son's old shirts so the local dogs could pick up the scent. Amy's mother always brought the disposable camera her daughter never finished. She said that if Amy was out there somewhere, she would want to capture whatever she saw. Some mornings their shoes were caked in red clay. Some afternoons they returned with hands bleeding from pushing aside thorny brush. Some days the rain turned the dirt roads slick as grease, but they still went. Because for a parent, doing nothing hurts worse than finding nothing. Lingering pain isn't like ordinary pain. It doesn't flare and fade. It settles deep, pulsing with every heartbeat. A reminder that certain wounds never fully heal. Sheriff Donnelly felt that truth more sharply than anyone. He still visited each family every week, not out of duty, but because he carried his own nameless burden. In their eyes, he saw the question they never voiced but always held. Why didn't you find our children? Why is the forest so silent? Why do all the clues disappear into the dark? And the question he couldn't answer even for himself. Why did this happen at all? At night, after finishing his shifts, Donnelly drove to the entrance of Red Hollow. He turned off the engine, stepped out, and sat on the hood of his car. Tennessee nights were usually peaceful, but nights at Red Hollow held a different kind of stillness, a silence so thick it felt like a hand resting on his shoulder, keeping him there. He would stare into the trees and listen. Insects, wind, branches brushing against one another. But sometimes in between those natural sounds he heard something else. Something faint, metallic, like metal dragging across stone, like an echo rising from beneath the ground. He never told anyone, because he hoped it was just his mind playing tricks, or prayed it was. By 2004, the case was officially labeled missing under unexplained circumstances. A cold, clinical line for a file. But to the families, it was a sentence, a declaration that hope had grown too small to be seen. The prayer circles dwindled. Reporters left, carrying the story away to be printed in distant cities. But the families remained, with the forest, with the pain, with the waiting. Years later, someone asked Josh's mother what kept her walking into the woods, knowing there was no easy answer waiting there. And she said, softly as morning fog, "When your child disappears, you can't sit still. Your heart pulls you forward, and you keep walking even when every step hurts. Grief like that isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It becomes a quieter version of life where even breathing feels deliberate. And memories must be handled gently, the way one handles glass." Donnelly grew older with each passing year, but his guilt did not fade. He felt as though Red Hollow had taken something he was meant to protect. Some nights he dreamed of the 4 children standing at the entrance to the forest, looking at him with expressions he would never forget, not accusing, just waiting, and he always woke with a heart heavy as stone. Helplessness isn't the absence of action. It's doing everything possible and being met only with silence. And the silence of Red Hollow throughout those years was the most terrifying of all. It wasn't the silence of nature. It was the silence of something watching from a distance, refusing to be seen. And from 2003 to 2004, as the investigation cooled and hope thinned, Red Hollow remained exactly as it had always been, unmoved, unapologetic, and unwilling to release what it had taken, because the secret it held was never a secret of the land. It was the fate of 4 children who walked into the woods one July afternoon and never came home. Time has its own way of erasing human footprints. It doesn't wipe them away violently, but quietly. In the slow mornings, when we wake and tell ourselves we've grown used enough to the pain to live with it, Red Hollow was like that too. Each year, the grass grew thicker, the trees taller, the trail the 4 children once walked slowly swallowed by the woods. People said nature always takes back what belongs to it. But in this place, it seemed to take even more. By the 2010 seconds, Red Hollow had become so overgrown it looked untouched by humans. The yellow warning signs had faded under the sun. The old fences meant to keep wanderers out were rotting away. In winter, snow layered over the mounds of earth like cold fragments of memory. In summer, the heat lifted the scent of young pines, masking every trace of the searches that once pounded through this forest. The disappearance of the 4 children became something spoken in low voices on church porches, at Thanksgiving tables. When the elders drifted into old stories, younger folks treated it like a cautionary tale, something to scare kids into staying away from the woods. To them, Red Hollow was a legend more than a tragedy, a place where things were swallowed by darkness and returned only as rumor. But for the families, time brought no forgetting. It only laid another layer of dust over the old pain. The Sunday walks into the woods grew less frequent, not because hope had died, but because the human body can only endure so many years of a journey without a destination. They went less, but they never stopped. Josh's father was the first to fall. He died in 2016, a sudden heart attack. Many in town believed his heart had been breaking long before. Ever since his son vanished, he'd kept Josh's baseball cap in his truck. He said that if Josh ever came home, he'd see the cap waiting for him just like his father was. Amy's mother passed 2 years later after a long illness. Even on her hospital bed, she held the disposable camera her daughter had left behind. She never developed the film, saying some memories shouldn't be revisited with the eyes, only with the heart. Her final words to her sister were the ones that broke people the most. If Amy comes back, she should know I never gave up on her. But the ones who needed to hear that were no longer there. The families scattered in the ways grief often tears people apart. Some moved away. Some tried to start over in new places. Some shrank into silence, living day by day through old routines to keep from thinking about what was gone. No one blamed anyone, but no one remained whole. By 2020, the case existed only in the gaze of the older residents whenever they looked toward the forest and sighed. When mentioned at all, people spoke in tones reserved for ghost stories. They said the woods echoed strangely, that when it rained, you could hear something from beneath the ground. That shapes appeared between the trees at night, only to vanish when approached. And then in a world pulled into the constant churn of social media, the Red Hollow case found new life. Not through law enforcement, not through the townspeople, but through a podcast. Vanished in Plain Air debuted in 2021 as a small project by 2 young hosts obsessed with cold cases. They stumbled onto Red Hollow almost by accident, but their low, haunting narration, the eerie mystery of the forest, the odd details, the wiped clean SUV, Ryan's static-filled call, the metallic noise in the rain ignited the story all over again online. Listeners said they'd never heard a case so sad. Sad because there was no villain to hate. Sad because there was no hope to cling to. The kind of sorrow that leaves you quiet afterward, staring out a window, wondering how a family could endure 20 years of not knowing. The 3rd episode went viral. Soon, journalists began returning to Monroe County. They found Donnelly, now retired. He agreed to a brief interview, his voice slow and weighted, each word carrying the shadow of years. "I did everything I could," he said, "but the forest is still there. And we can't see through it." Those simple words shook the internet. People debated. They analyzed. They posted maps. They built timelines. Some insisted it had to be a crime. Others pointed to geological anomalies. Others still believed it was an unexplainable group accident. But no matter the theory, one thing never changed. The 4 children never returned. And Red Hollow still stood, a cold witness to time. In 2023, on the 20th anniversary of their disappearance, the remaining family members gathered once more at the trailhead. Not as many as before. No more shouting. No more sobbing. Just a few figures standing quietly, staring into the woods as if looking at the lost years of their own lives. A sharp wind blew through. Pine needles scattered in dull yellow. Someone said a relative of Caleb whispered, "The hardest part isn't not knowing what happened. The hardest part is time moving on while your heart refuses to." No one answered, because they all understood. From 2003 to 2023, the Red Hollow case became more than a case. It became a scar on the soul of the community. A story people told to remind themselves that some things in life cannot be held, cannot be named, cannot be saved. And as the sun sank behind the tree line, the forest fell into a darkness thick as velvet. No one knew that just a year later, the secret Red Hollow had buried for 20 years would begin to rise again. No one knew the things long asleep would return powerfully, terrifyingly, beyond anything they could imagine. But that night, they simply stood there, watching the forest, feeling it watch them back, slowly, silently, with intent. Time has its own way of erasing human footprints. It doesn't wipe them away violently, but quietly. In the slow mornings when we wake and tell ourselves we've grown used enough to the pain to live with it, Red Hollow was like that too. Each year, the grass grew thicker, the trees taller. The trail the 4 children once walked slowly swallowed by the woods. People said nature always takes back what belongs to it, but in this place, it seemed to take even more. By the 2010 seconds, Red Hollow had become so overgrown it looked untouched by humans. The yellow warning signs had faded under the sun. The old fences meant to keep wanderers out were rotting away. In winter, snow layered over the mounds of earth like cold fragments of memory. In summer, the heat lifted the scent of young pines, masking every trace of the searches that once pounded through this forest. The disappearance of the 4 children became something spoken in low voices on church porches, at Thanksgiving tables, when the elders drifted into old stories. Younger folks treated it like a cautionary tale, something to scare kids into staying away from the woods. To them, Red Hollow was a legend more than a tragedy. A place where things were swallowed by darkness and returned only as rumor. But for the families, time brought no forgetting. It only laid another layer of dust over the old pain. The Sunday walks into the woods grew less frequent, not because hope had died, but because the human body can only endure so many years of a journey without a destination. They went less, but they never stopped. Josh's father was the first to fall. He died in 2016, a sudden heart attack. Many in town believed his heart had been breaking long before. Ever since his son vanished, he'd kept Josh's baseball cap in his truck. He said that if Josh ever came home, he'd see the cap waiting for him, just like his father was. Amy's mother passed 2 years later after a long illness. Even on her hospital bed, she held the disposable camera her daughter had left behind. She never developed the film, saying some memories shouldn't be revisited with the eyes, only with the heart. Her final words to her sister were the ones that broke people the most. "If Amy comes back, she should know I never gave up on her." But the ones who needed to hear that were no longer there. The families scattered in the ways grief often tears people apart. Some moved away. Some tried to start over in new places. Some shrank into silence, living day by day through old routines to keep from thinking about what was gone. No one blamed anyone, but no one remained whole. By 2020, the case existed only in the gaze of the older residents whenever they looked toward the forest and sighed. When mentioned at all, people spoke in tones reserved for ghost stories. They said the woods echoed strangely, that when it rained, you could hear something from beneath the ground, that shapes appeared between the trees at night, only to vanish when approached. And then, in a world pulled into the constant churn of social media, the Red Hollow case found new life, not through law enforcement, not through the townspeople, But through a podcast, Vanished in Plain Air debuted in 2021 as a small project by two young hosts obsessed with cold cases. They stumbled onto Red Hollow almost by accident, but their low, haunting narration, the eerie mystery of the forest, the odd details, the wiped-clean SUV, Ryan's static-filled call, the metallic noise in the rain ignited the story all over again online. Listeners said they'd never heard a case so sad. Sad because there was no villain to hate. Sad because there was no hope to cling to. The kind of sorrow that leaves you quiet afterward, staring out a window, wondering how a family could endure 20 years of not knowing. The third episode went viral. Soon, journalists began returning to Monroe County. They found Donnelly, now retired. He agreed to a brief interview, his voice slow and weighted, each word carrying the shadow of years. "I did everything I could," he said. "But the forest is still there, and we can't see through it." Those simple words shook the internet. People debated. They analyzed. They posted maps. They built timelines. Some insisted it had to be a crime. Others pointed to geological anomalies. Others still believed it was an unexplainable group accident. But no matter the theory, one thing never changed. The four children never returned. And Red Hollow still stood, a cold witness to time. In 2023, on the 20th anniversary of their disappearance, the remaining family members gathered once more at the trailhead. Not as many as before. No more shouting. No more sobbing. Just a few figures standing quietly, staring into the woods, as if looking at the lost years of their own lives. A sharp wind blew through. Pine needles scattered in dull yellow. Someone said a relative of Caleb whispered, "The hardest part isn't not knowing what happened. The hardest part is time moving on while your heart refuses to." No one answered, because they all understood. From 2003 to 2023, the Red Hollow case became more than a case. It became a scar on the soul of the community, a story people told to remind themselves that some things in life cannot be held, cannot be named, cannot be saved. And as the sun sank behind the tree line, the forest fell into a darkness thick as velvet. No one knew that just a year later, the secret Red Hollow had buried for 20 years would begin to rise again. No one knew the things long asleep would return powerfully, terrifyingly, beyond anything they could imagine. But that night, they simply stood there, watching the forest, feeling it watch them back, slowly, silently, with intent. In 2024, Monroe County slipped into a strange spring. The air warmed earlier than usual. Trees bloomed too soon. Yellow pollen drifted across the roofs of old wooden houses like dust stirred from a forgotten memory. But the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the entire town were holding its breath, waiting for something no one could yet name. In a small office behind the county sheriff's building, Detective Laura Hensley sat before a mountain of old files faded so much that the ink was lighter than the paper. Sunlight streamed through the window and fell across her desk, catching the edge of a case folder dated 2003-1. Every officer in the department knew by heart. Robburn, Thomas, Carter, Lane, missing juveniles, Red Hollow. Laura turned through each page, each interview transcript, each yellowed film photograph. Some said cold cases were like old doors opened not by force but by patience. But to Laura, the Red Hollow case wasn't a door. It was a room she had stood outside for 20 years, one she never forgot, one that still made her heart pound in a way she couldn't explain. She'd been born in 1997. When the four kids vanished, she was only 6, but the memory never left her. She remembered her mother standing beside the tiny living room TV, holding Laura close as the evening news read out the 4 names. Josh, Ryan, Amy, Caleb. The newscaster's voice was steady, but those names fell into the small wooden house with an unbearable weight. Her mother had sighed a sound that Laura still carried inside her, the sigh of a southern woman who understood how the land could hold on to things, even children. The next morning, Laura's father gave her a bottle of water and a flashlight before heading out to help with the search. When she asked why he had to go, he ruffled her hair and said, "If a child calls for help, you don't turn your back." She didn't know then how deeply that sentence would shape her life. As she grew older, hearing whispered stories about Red Hollow, hearing the grief, The years of searching. The families fractured, she felt the case tugging at her, not out of curiosity, but out of something softer, deeper, as if the 4 missing kids had become part of her own memory. So, in 2024, when the podcast revived the story, when reporters returned to town, when people began asking why no one had reopened the file, she knew she had to be the one to do it, not for attention, not for public pressure, but because of a private promise she'd carried all her life. When I grow up, I'll be the one who looks for them. In March, Laura formally requested permission to reopen the Red Hollow case. The department buzzed for days. Some thought it was pointless. Some said 20 years erased everything worth finding. Some simply warned that Red Hollow wasn't a place you dug into lightly. But Laura answered calmly, "That's why I have to do it now." On the first day of the reopened investigation, she pulled on white gloves and opened the old evidence bags. A lighter. A torn corner of a map. A smudged note. The photograph of Josh's wiped-clean SUV. None of the items held legal weight anymore, but they held time fragments of a story she was determined to pick up. Knowing the final picture might be far more painful than anyone wanted to see, she called the surviving family members. She spoke with them. She listened. What struck her most was that none of them turned her away. No anger. No bitterness. Only one quiet question spoken in soft Tennessee voices. "What made you come back to this?" Laura told the truth. She said she grew up with this story. She said she wanted to know where the 4 kids went, what the forest kept, why their families never got the answers they deserved. Each person fell silent for a moment. Then they all said the same thing. "Thank you for not forgetting them." Over the next months, Laura hiked into Red Hollow again and again, each time farther, each time standing longer at the patch of ground where the SUV once sat. Sometimes it drizzled, and the rising smell of wet earth felt like the forest breathing. She stood among the pines, listening to the wind slip through them, feeling just faintly that something was watching her, not threatening, not malicious, just aware. She wasn't afraid. She'd grown up understanding that some places didn't open themselves to just anyone. Some places waited for the right person to ask the right question, and Laura believed Red Hollow had been waiting for her. By summer, she submitted her formal report, new DNA testing from the families, a full review of 2003 evidence with modern tech, a geological reconstruction of the forest floor, searching for clues no one had the tools to see 2 decades earlier. In one meeting, an older officer argued the case should remain buried. "It's too deep," he said. "Leave it alone." Laura looked straight at him and replied with a sentence that silenced the entire room. "No one is truly buried until the truth is found." One late August afternoon, sunlight slanting through brittle branches, Laura parked at the forest's edge and stepped out. No team. No cameras. No helicopters. Just her and the ancient ground waiting beneath her feet. She stood where the 4 kids had stepped into the woods for the last time. The wind threaded through the pines. And in that quiet moment, she felt something she wouldn't dare say aloud. That Red Hollow was preparing to speak. That its secret, after 20 years, no longer wished to stay buried. And from that stillness, a new chapter of the case began. A chapter that would drag the truth from the dark soil into daylight, no matter how painful that truth turned out to be. In early September 2024, Red Hollow woke to a morning unlike any it had seen before. The fog was so thick that when the sun broke through, the entire forest looked wrapped in a thin silver veil. A cold wind slipped through the pine branches, making them crackle softly, like whispers from an older time. It was the kind of morning seasoned Tennessee hunters knew well, a morning that warned something was about to change. Mark Ellison didn't believe in omens. He lived simply, like most Southern men raised in the woods, spending his life facing nature without ever trying to explain it. But that morning, as he slung his bow across his shoulder and stepped onto the old eastern trail of Red Hollow, he felt his heartbeat slow. Not from fear, from the quiet, unshakable sense that this hunt would not be like the others. Mark was 43, now quiet, steady. The kind of man who spoke only when he had something worth saying. He'd joined the search team back in 2003, when he was 22. He still remembered the faces of the 4 missing kids on the flyers. He remembered the hollow look in their parents' eyes as they stared into the forest, as if searching for answers they already knew would never come. Maybe that was why he hadn't hunted deep inside Red Hollow for years. That patch of forest held too many unnamed things. But that day, the wildlife had shifted earlier than usual, and Mark needed a new wind path to set up. He stepped past low brush, his boots sinking into a carpet of red leaves. Sunlight pierced through the breaks in the canopy, creating scattered pools of gold and shadow, like a fractured painting. Mark bent to examine a deer track when he noticed something strange. The dirt ahead had been disturbed, not by animals, not by weather. The small stones were arranged too evenly, as if someone had tried to cover something beneath them. He stopped. The earlier unease crystallized into a cold line running down his spine. Mark knelt. He brushed aside a few stones. The soil beneath was darker, packed, unnatural. Then the sunlight sliced through the fog just enough to flash against a pale, curved surface. He thought it was a stone until he pushed more dirt aside, and his heart stopped. It was bone. Human bone. For a long, suspended second, he couldn't breathe. His hands froze, as though the earth itself held them. He knew exactly what he was looking at. The perfect curve. The smooth surface, faintly catching the light through the dust. Part of a skull. He stumbled back and found himself sitting on the ground without remembering how he got there. The forest around him had gone impossibly still. No birds. No rustling leaves. Only the sound of his pulse hammering so hard it felt like something inside him might crack. Mark wasn't a man who panicked. He'd seen hunting accidents. He'd handled wounded animals. But a human skull in Red Hollow after 22 years? No one wanted to find that. No one wanted to be the first to see it. He swallowed hard, trying to force his breath steady. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. Instinct took over. He dialed the sheriff's office. When the dispatcher picked up, his voice scraped out. Rough and unfamiliar even to him. I think I found something in Red Hollow. Something not from an animal. He couldn't say the word bone. It clogged in his throat, as if speaking it aloud would make everything too real. Waiting for law enforcement felt like the longest stretch of time in his life. Mark stood but had to lean against a tree as the shock spun his vision. Still, his eyes kept drifting back to the disturbed stones, unable to trust or deny what he had seen. And then he noticed something else. Beside the exposed piece of bone lay a fragment of cracked black rubber, like the sole of an old shoe. A shred of faded blue fabric. And farther off, something metallic, half buried in the soil. He brushed the earth away. A metal bottle emerged. 2 letters were etched into it. Junior. Josh Raburn. A name the town had never forgotten. A name Mark had pinned to bulletin boards 22 years ago when he was still young. A bitter shock surged through him. He closed his eyes for 1 second, but the weight of memory forced them open again. Red Hollow, the place that had swallowed 4 children, was finally giving something back. And Mark, the man who most wanted to stay out of the forest's shadows, had become the first to hear its new whisper. When the officers arrived, Mark stood several yards away from the site, his hands shoved in his jacket pockets to hide the trembling. A young deputy asked if he was all right. Mark nodded. Though he knew this moment would never leave him, the new sheriff shook his hand, thanking him for calling. But Mark met the sheriff's gaze and said something that froze everyone around him. I didn't find them. They found me. Not dramatic, not cryptic, just the truest thing he could say. Because he knew he hadn't come here looking for anything. But the forest, somehow, had chosen to show him what it had hidden for 2 decades. When the forensics team began digging, Mark turned away. Not out of fear of the remains, but fear of everything that came with them. The family's grief, the town's old guilt, the memories he'd tried to bury. Yet, even with his back turned, he heard every sound. The scrape of shovels, the hard knock of metal against rust, the sharp inhale of a deputy as another scrap of fabric surfaced. And Mark understood that the silence of Red Hollow had ended. It had begun to speak, and none of them knew whether they were ready for what it would say next. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the tall pines, the light inside the forest shifted to a muted bronze. Sunbeams filtered through the thinning veil of fog, hanging in the air like strands of gold suspended between the trees. It wasn't beautiful light. It was the kind of light Southerners say appears when the day is about to leave something behind on the earth. The forensics team set up quickly. Portable floodlights snapped on, their warm yellow glow spreading across the damp red soil. A faint breeze stirred the scent of old pines and freshly turned dirt. The air felt thick with something unspoken, like the forest itself had gone still. Waiting, the technicians knelt and brushed away the soil in thin, deliberate strokes. The soft patter of dirt falling into plastic trays was barely audible. Yet in the heavy, quiet, it sounded unnervingly loud. Steady, cold. No one spoke. No one dared break the silence. Everyone knew whatever lay beneath had been waiting 22 years to be seen again. The new sheriff stood beside Mark Ellison, the man who'd made the discovery, but his eyes never left the marked patch of ground. Mark stared at his boots, willing his hands not to shake. He heard the forensic team shifting behind him, the faint hiss of a radio, the scratch of a pen on a clipboard. Then all of it faded when one of the technicians leaned closer and whispered, "I've got something." No one asked what. They all knew the first thing to surface would be bone. But the man's voice carried reverence and caution, as if he were looking at a secret nature hadn't wanted to surrender. A cluster of ivory-colored bone emerged beneath the dark earth, fragmented, incomplete, but unmistakable. A part of someone who had once walked into this forest with strong legs and a whole life ahead. The yellow floodlight washed over the exposed bone, over the cracked dirt, over scraps of fabric half buried in the soil. As the technician brushed away more dirt, the metal bottle came into full view, the one Mark had glimpsed earlier. The initials on it gleamed faintly. Junior. No one spoke, but the truth settled on them like the cold air around their ankles. They had found Josh. Silence fell again so deep it felt as though the forest were listening. Then Donnelly, the sheriff who'd led the search in 2003, stepped forward. His hair had gone gray, but his eyes were the same eyes of a man who had carried 20 years of responsibility on his back. He looked down and said softly, "Let's bring this boy home." Not a command, not a procedural note. A promise spoken by a man who had once failed to find these kids, now standing at the edge of his last chance to return something to their families. The digging continued. Dirt fell into trays with the same steady rhythm, the same hollow chill. Dust drifted up through the yellow light like pale smoke. Minutes later, something else appeared, a scrap of bluish-gray cloth, frayed but still intact enough to recognize. Someone murmured, "That's Caleb's jacket." No one breathed. No one stepped forward, because they all understood what that meant. There wasn't just one child here. And the ground beneath their feet felt suddenly heavier, as if it held more stories than anyone wanted to hear but had no choice but to face. The team widened the excavation. Slowly, a second cluster of bones surfaced, a few feet from the first. Not deep, not carefully placed, not laid to rest by loving hands. It looked hurried, covered just enough to hide, not enough to bury. A technician exhaled sharply, a breath more sorrow than fear. 2 boys, side by side, under red hollow soil for 2 decades. When their belongings were identified, the confirmation settled over the clearing like an iron weight. The second set of remains belonged to Caleb Thomas. And when that was said aloud, no one standing there escaped the tightening in their chest. These were professionals, investigators, technicians, deputies who'd never met the teens. But standing over their bones felt like standing over their own kin, like standing at the edge of a story too human to distance themselves from. No one is ever prepared for the sight of it. 2 small sets of remains, lying close together, like 2 boys who had leaned into each other for warmth on a cold night. Josh, 19, Caleb, 18. Half-lived years, half-built dreams, half-spoken promises. A technician froze when he uncovered a burned fragment of a necklace strap nearby. He touched it gently with the tip of his glove and whispered, "They weren't alone. They were together." The forest seemed to still even further. The wind paused, as if the woods themselves were listening, mourning. Mark Ellison stood farther back, but every word reached him. His chest tightened painfully as memories surged back. A mother shouting her child's name, boots pounding up the hillside, hope splintering day by day, until only silence remained. He turned away, lifting a hand to shield his face not from the lights, but from the heat rising behind his eyes. When the technicians finally lifted the evidence bags, the yellow floodlights cast long shadows behind them, two elongated silhouettes stretching across the dirt, like the outlines of two young men walking out of the forest for the first time in 22 years. A young deputy whispered, "So this means we're finally finding them?" Donnelly's reply was rough, tired, honest. "No, they're finding their way back to us." And everyone felt the truth of that, because this clearing didn't hold just two sets of remains. It didn't hold just bones. It didn't hold just evidence. It held the beginning of a story rising from the dirt, a story Red Hollow had gripped for 22 years. And now, at last, it had started to emerge. After the two bodies were removed from the clearing, the forensic team didn't leave Red Hollow right away. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The ground hadn't finished speaking. Something deeper, heavier, older, was still waiting beneath that red Tennessee soil, swelling like a secret finally pressing toward the surface. The next morning, the geologist arrived with a GPR scanner. The screen flickered with bands of faint waves, distortions from roots, from rocks, from the natural noise of the forest floor. Then, in the lower left corner of the display, a shape appeared. Rectangular, wide, long, too defined to be natural. A technician whispered, "That's not bedrock. Not a root system. Whatever that is, it's metal." Everyone exchanged a look. No one voiced their fear, but it was written clearly across their faces. They all understood. After 22 years, the forest wasn't giving back only two bodies. It was giving back more. The search perimeter was widened by 20 feet. A backhoe scraped off the upper layer of soil. But anything deeper had to be done by hand. The earth there was unnaturally dense. Each shovel strike rang out with a dull, muted thud, not the sound of dirt, but something heavier, hollower. The wind pushed through the pines, carrying the scent of wet soil mixed with something faintly metallic like rust waking from sleep. Then the shovel struck metal. A sharp clang cut through the clearing, cold enough to make a young deputy instinctively step back, not from fear, but because, in that moment, it felt like the forest exhaled. When the last layer of soil was brushed away, the entire team froze. Lying on its side, angled as if it had been trying to claw its way back to the surface for decades, was an old county maintenance truck. 70s era. Long bed. The remnants of what had once been bright orange paint were now just streaks of black rust. Roots had wrapped themselves around the tires like they were holding the truck in place. A forensic tech checked the faded plate and murmured, "GMC. 78 model. County property. Reported missing in 1989. Silence swept the clearing. The truck had vanished 14 years before the kids disappeared in 2003. A ghost from a different era. So why was it buried here beneath the same ground where they had just found two boys? When they forced open the cab, the hinges groaned like old bones stiffening in the cold. The door swung open, releasing a puff of stale dust. Inside was darkness, mold, decay, the unmistakable smell of metal rotting from the inside out. A spotlight swept across the cracked seats, the corroded dashboard, the charred wiring. Then it stopped. On the cab floor, half buried in mud and bits of plastic, were three fused objects warped into one solid, blackened mass. 3 cell phones, melted together as if they'd been heated and pressed into one piece. No one could speak. One of the technicians covered his mouth, whispering, "No way. Those are from 2003. How the hell did they end up in a truck from 78? According to the case file, those phones had belonged to Ryan, Amy, and Caleb. They had been listed as unrecovered. No pings, no traces, nothing. And yet here they were, inside a vehicle lost when their parents were younger than the kids had been. A tech lifted the fused phones with thick gloves. The brittle plastic crackled like something breaking after years under pressure, less like debris, and more like a secret tearing free of the earth. The sheriff stepped forward, staring at the block of phones as if looking at an answer he was terrified to understand. Laura Hensley arrived within minutes. The shock on her face didn't hide itself. She pressed a hand to her chest as she stared at the half-buried truck, at the rotted cab, the burned wires, and the 3 phones she'd memorized from the old file. She whispered to herself, 22 years. And they've been here. inside a truck that disappeared from a different decade. Southerners often say old ground keeps better memories than people. But this was not memory. This was a link between two timelines that should never have touched. When a technician tapped the truck frame, rusted dust fell like red rain. Beneath it, in the passenger side corner, another object appeared. A handheld radio, cracked in half, but with a label still legible. Property of Monroe County Maintenance. Laura picked it up. Her hand shook so badly she had to tighten her grip just to keep from dropping it. She looked at it the way someone looks at a confession. This wasn't from 2003. This belonged to 1989, the year the truck vanished. So how had 3 modern cell phones ended up in a vehicle buried more than a decade before the kids ever stepped into Red Hollow? No one dared speak the first theory forming in their minds. It was too impossible for logic, too violent to contemplate, too devastating for the families. That the kids had been here, that someone had opened this cab while they were still alive, that what happened to them wasn't a simple case of getting lost, but part of something older, something that began in 1989 and didn't end in 2003. From a distance, Mark Ellison approached, finally allowing himself to look into the cab he'd avoided all morning. When he saw the fused phones, the color drained from his face. He asked nothing. He didn't have to, because in that moment, he knew he had just stepped into the next, more painful chapter of the case he had never wanted to reopen. By the time the crew began breaking down the scene, the sun had already set. The rusted truck frame caught the last streaks of dusk, looking like the skeleton of something ancient pulled from the grave. No one spoke as they packed up. No one wanted to disturb the weight hanging over the clearing. Laura stayed long after the others. She stared at the truck, at the torn-up soil, at the darkening woods. Then she whispered, just loud enough for herself to hear, "Red Hollow doesn't just swallow people, it swallows time." And with that, everyone understood. The investigation had crossed into a place none of them were prepared to enter. The Tennessee State Forensics Lab was nearly an hour from Monroe County. But when Laura Hensley walked inside, she felt as though she'd stepped into a new chapter of the old story she'd been carrying since childhood. The sharp chemical smell, the humming neon lights, the cold metal cabinets that looked capable of storing the memories of an entire generation. They made her grip her notebook tighter. Her chest constricted every time the image of the unearthed maintenance truck flashed through her mind. 2 forensic analysts waited for her by an examination table. On it, 3 evidence containers sat in a row. 3 melted-together cell phones, a scorched handheld radio, a length of wiring twisted by extreme heat. Silent objects yet heavy enough to puncture the timeline of 2003 like 3 pins driven straight through it. One of the analysts spoke first, his voice low, as if addressing the dead. "We have preliminary findings. And this doesn't match anything from the original case." 1. Laura straightened, nodding slowly, bracing herself the way someone does when standing at the rim of a drop-off. As they explained, the details fell one by one like soil sliding off the remains of the 4 children. Carbon buildup in Josh and Caleb's bones indicated both boys had inhaled extremely high levels of carbon monoxide near the time of death, not for seconds long enough for the lungs to bear the imprint of desperation. Skull fractures weren't from blunt force assault but likely from something heavy collapsing from above. One analyst continued, "If the ceiling of some kind of structure caved in, it would have to be very old, very unstable, and close to the surface." Laura frowned. "You're saying there was a chamber, a tunnel, under the forest?" He nodded. "We found traces of lime, cement, and sections of corroded ducting. Materials used in drainage systems back in the 70s. Her stomach tightened. She remembered the old, half-erased map from the original investigation, one that showed a drainage tunnel project that had never been completed due to budget cuts. An unfinished line beneath the forest. The tunnel was marked near Gully 3B, and Gully 3B was right beside where the bodies had been found. She exhaled slowly. So how did the truck end up directly above it? The analysts exchanged glances before one answered. The ground may have collapsed beneath the truck. The tunnel wasn't deep, but deep enough to swallow part of the vehicle. Over time, soil settled and hid everything. A chill ran along her skin. A truck vanished in 1989. A drainage tunnel from the 70s. A disappearance in 2003. all stacked on top of each other in the same patch of earth. But what shook her most was the final question. How did the kids' phones get into the cab of that truck? The reply chilled the entire room. We found scraping marks and newer soil residue inside the cab. It's not original to a truck from '78. Someone opened that door between 2003 and 2005. Laura's knuckles whitened as she gripped her notebook, which meant someone knew this place existed. Someone accessed that truck. Someone put the kids' belongings inside. The leading hypothesis was brutal in its simplicity. The 4 teenagers may have gone into the unfinished tunnel during the storm seeking shelter, unaware of the trapped gas below. When the truck shifted into the void, it could have forced carbon monoxide into the shaft. If the kids were inside, they wouldn't have stood a chance. Another analyst added quietly, if the tunnel ceiling collapsed, it would explain the fracture patterns. Laura looked down at the floor, trying to picture the final minutes of 4 teenagers. A dim light, a narrow shaft, breathing growing heavier, air thinning, metal groaning overhead, then darkness falling all at once. Her heart twisted painfully. She asked, her voice strained, what about human involvement? Any evidence of interference? Doc. The lead analyst nodded slowly. The most important items are right here. He gestured to the fused cell phones. Plastic melts at these temperatures only under direct focused heat. This wasn't a vehicle fire, not a forest burn. It looks like deliberate exposure to a heat source, possibly an attempt to destroy them. Laura closed her eyes for a moment. A heavy, metallic ache spread from her throat to her chest. Someone tried to destroy the phones. Someone saw evidence of what happened before law enforcement arrived. Someone wanted the truth from 2003 erased, which meant this was no longer just an accident. She opened her eyes. Forensics staff stood waiting for her reaction. She kept herself steady, though her voice thinned, cracking at the edges. Those 4 kids died in the dark, but someone knew. Someone saw something. Someone didn't help, didn't call, didn't report. A silence fell so deep the ventilation hum felt loud. Laura continued, softer. And if someone turned their back on them then? That someone is still out there. Someone who knew about the tunnel. Someone who knew about the truck. The analyst concluded, this case isn't closing. It's reopening. Laura stared at the lab report. Her eyes locked on 3 handwritten words. Human interference likely. There was human involvement, not rumor, not speculation, not hysteria. A truth had risen from the ground. Like that buried maintenance truck, like those melted phones, like the desperation etched into the bones of 4 kids from 2003. Laura shut her notebook, lifted her head, and said quietly, with the steadiness of land before it collapses, Red Hollow hasn't finished speaking, and I'm seeing this through to the end. April 2026. Just as the dogwoods were bursting into white along the federal highway, and the spring winds finally softened the stubborn chill of East Tennessee, the Monroe County Sheriff's Office held a press conference many believed would never come. 23 years after 4 teenagers vanished. 23 years of hollow hope and grief stacked on grief. And now, at last, an official conclusion was ready to be spoken out loud. The briefing room was small and plain, washed in the sunlight that poured through the single window and fell across a wooden table where evidence sat covered beneath a white sheet. Seating for the families was arranged in the front row. Chairs that once would have overflowed were now barely filled, just a handful of relatives who had lived long enough and painfully enough to sit for this moment. They entered quietly. No greetings, just trembling hands. Eyes already glassed over from tears shed decades ago. The new sheriff stood beside Detective Laura Hensley. He glanced down at the report, then lifted his eyes to the room and drew a long breath. His voice emerged low and rough, the kind that carried 20 years of Red Hollow's mud and silence. Today, we're releasing the official conclusion regarding the disappearance of the 4 teenagers in 2003. Based on forensic analysis, excavation findings, and structural surveys of the abandoned drainage system, the cause of death is determined to be carbon monoxide poisoning, combined with injuries sustained from a structural collapse. The room went still. Not with shock, only the ache of hearing a truth finally called by its name. Laura stepped forward and gently lifted the sheet, revealing enlarged prints from the forensic lab. A map of a half-built drainage tunnel. From the 1,970 seconds. The location of the maintenance truck buried beneath the earth, soil cross-sections showing layers disturbed in 2005, and photos recovered from a disposable camera, one showing a faint red streak, like the glow of a heater in a cramped, suffocating dark. Her voice was steady, soft, and sure, the voice of someone who spent her youth stitching meaning into other people's pain. We now believe the teens strayed off the main route during a storm. They discovered an opening into an abandoned drainage tunnel system. These tunnels were partially constructed for a road project in the late 70s, but were never finished. A mother in the front row placed a hand over her heart, as if to keep it from falling apart. Laura continued. During the storm, erosion exposed a small fracture above the tunnel entrance. The teens likely climbed down, seeking shelter, or out of curiosity. Evidence shows they carried a small heating device for light and warmth. She paused, offering space for families who'd lost children in 2003 to gather themselves. After the storm, runoff triggered a landslide that dragged the 1,978 maintenance truck downward. When the truck shifted, the unfinished ventilation piping connected to the tunnel forced carbon monoxide into the space where the teens were standing. A father folded forward in his seat, burying his face in his hands. Someone placed a hand on his back. No one spoke. Silence was the only language that could carry grief here. Moments later, Laura said quietly, the weakened ceiling gave way. That collapse caused the skull fractures on two of the victims. The soil continued to fall, burying the entire chamber. That is why the 2003 search teams found nothing. A journalist spoke up, softly. What about the phones found inside the truck's cabin? And the soil that appeared disturbed in 2005? The sheriff looked at Laura. She nodded. This is the hardest part of the conclusion, she said. And the part we acknowledge will never come with absolute certainty. She revealed a blown-up image of the 2005 boot print. A grown man's footprint pressed directly above the excavation site, angled outward, toward the forest. In 2005, Roy Dalton, a contracted worker, was assigned cleanup near Gully 3B. Soil analysis confirms that someone dug into the collapsed structure that year. Whoever it was, reached the top of the chamber. He would have realized human remains were beneath him. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, a softness meant to avoid breaking an old wound wide open. He left. He didn't report it. And months later, he disappeared. You could hear the wind outside brushing against the courthouse windows. The sheriff added, as for the 3 phones in the truck cabin, it's possible the landslide carried items from the tunnel into the vehicle. It's also possible Roy found them and left them there. But we have no evidence confirming how it happened. Another journalist raised a hand. So the last question, why weren't they found? For 2 decades? Laura looked down at her hands. Because everything stacked up like fate. An abandoned tunnel. A truck swallowed in 1989. A storm in 2003. An unreported landslide in 2005. And a forest that hides secrets better than any human ever could. Then she looked at the families. Not every question will be answered. Not every secret will be recovered. Some stories nature keeps for itself. And Red Hollow kept this one for far too long. Amy's mother clasped her hands together, thin, trembling. A father stood and bowed his head, thanking them with a voice now frayed from 23 years of wearing grief like weather. The men and women who once walked the forest at night calling their children's names now could only exhale at the weight of a truth they could not change. The sheriff closed the conference with the words of former Sheriff Carl Donnelly, the line Laura had carried since childhood. We find the truth, but never the whole truth. And on that Tennessee spring afternoon, under pale sunlight slanting through the window, everyone understood. The 2026 conclusion wasn't just the end of an investigation. It was the final gravestone, the last punctuation mark on a story that began with the laughter of 4 kids on a dirt road. Red Hollow no longer held them. The ground had finally returned them to their families. But the price of that truth was too great, and those who survived would carry it for the rest of their lives. There are stories that never truly end. They just settle quiet, heavy into the soil, like old rain that never quite evaporates. When the sun comes up, they're still there, soaked into the roots, into the wind, into the way people look at each other when they pass a dark stretch of woods. Red Hollow is one of those stories. It began with 4 kids laughing on the back of an old pickup truck, and it ended on a spring afternoon where the ones who survived finally had to face a truth that had waited far too long. When the families of Josh, Ryan, Caleb, and Amy returned to the forest to place 4 small wooden crosses, the sky held steady. No rain, no sharp wind, none of the metallic whispering the townsfolk swore they'd heard for years. There was only a gentle stillness, like Red Hollow had finally exhaled the breath it had been holding for more than 2 decades. The crosses stood in a simple line, nothing ornate, nothing polished, each one driven into the earth like an old prayer, each one carved by the trembling hands of parents who had run out of tears long ago. No one spoke much. Some grief is so deep that silence is the only thing sturdy enough to hold it. A mother traced the edge of her child's cross, her fingers trembling, not from cold, but because, at long last, after 23 years, she had a place to lay flowers, a place to whisper the apology she had repeated 1,000 times in her sleep. Behind her, a father stood stiff-backed, eyes raw. Southern men carry heartbreak like an old injury. Quietly, stubbornly. Even when it split them open from the inside, Laura watched from a distance. She knew she had brought them the truth, but not what they truly wanted. Justice can't return a stolen youth. A single wrong turn can't be undone by an autopsy or a report. But she stayed anyway, steady, patient, like someone standing at the edge of the ocean, knowing full well the tide will never return what it has taken. Former Sheriff Donnelly, once the fragile thread of hope in 2003, was now an old man. His hair white, his shoulders curved, but when he laid his hand on the first cross, something softened in his face, maybe because he finally brought the kids home, not whole. Not the way he once vowed he would, but home. Residents of Monroe County, the ones who had walked those hills night after night in the summer of the disappearance, stood in a loose circle. They weren't there to witness an ending. They were there to say they remembered, that the story hadn't slipped into the cracks the way tragedies in small towns often do. They were there to show that no matter how well Red Hollow hid its secrets, the human heart could still stand together against the dark. As the sun sank lower, the light washed over the crosses like 4 thin strokes of gold. Someone lit a candle. Then someone else. Soon, the whole clearing flickered with trembling flames. Those flames looked like the ones the kids once gathered around, laughing before their last trip into the woods. Only now, the fire wasn't for fear. It was for memory. The narrator's voice low, steady, carrying the weight and warmth of the entire journey, settled over the moment. There are secrets buried so deep we once believed they would never be found. But even those rise, eventually. There are wounds that seem destined to live forever in shadow. And yet, somehow, light always finds its way in. We don't get to choose what happens. We don't get to choose the road. We don't get to choose who leaves us too soon. But we do get to choose one thing. We choose not to forget them. And in that final moment, as the camera pulls back from the 4 small crosses, as candlelight flickers against the dusk, as the clearing darkens into the first breath of night, the voice returns, clear and unwavering, beautiful in its sorrow. We do not get to choose the ending, but we can choose not to let anyone disappear from memory. The screen fades to black. Only the sound of wind through the pines remains. A promise. Soft, enduring, and meant to last.